mental designs and some definitions, looking at the scientific methodology. I want to continue this week. We look at the experimental design. So we look at what is a true experiment, what are the characteristics of a true experiment, and then we'll talk about some other things like variables, and then we can call it a day. All right, so if we ask ourselves what is a true experiment, I think in my earlier week's explanation, if we want to conduct an experiment, there is a need for the experimenter, or sometimes what we call the researcher. The person should make an active effort at manipulating a variable. Okay, so if we talk about manipulation of variable, we mean that we should be able to vary some variable, change its forms. But one of the other things which are also, can I please ask that we all mute ourselves, please? Let's try and mute ourselves. There's also what we call randomization, and I'll break randomization down. So in every experiment, we call something randomization. Now, randomization involves two things. One, the first thing is what we call random selection. Now, random selection means that everybody in this class will have an equal chance of being selected to be involved in the experiment. So, random selection, usually we use something like a balloting system. So, everybody, assuming I have maybe one iPhone 15 Pro Max, for example, or 15 Pro, and I want to give to one person in this class, everybody think I want it, but we need to be very fair. So I can see about 200 people on this class. We do some form of balloting, and then everybody will pick a piece of paper. All the papers have no, except one. So the one who picks the yes. So in random selection is some kind of fairness where everybody have a chance. And then we do what we call random assignment. So random assignment means that we'll put people into groups, but the groups that we want to put them into, they don't know which group they will go into. So subsequently, we talk more about this. So we randomly assign the independent variables to the groups or participants involved. And I mentioned earlier that every experiment that we conduct, there should be the need for us to control extraneous variables. If you can't control extraneous variables in your experiment, you cannot say that there's a cause and effect relationship. So, for example, if we want to find out how alcohol intake influences recall or memory, now ideally, if you are doing an experiment, we want to be sure that it is only the alcohol intake that has influenced the recall or memory. But we know in the real world that there are so many things that can influence one ability to recall. So those other things, something like IQ, or even some physiological things that may be wrong with the person. Okay, or some people may have some traumatic issues, or some people may have some part of their brain, part of the brain, maybe the frontal lobe may have some challenges, or there's some diseases or illness. If we don't control for all these other things that I've mentioned are possible external variables. So in every experiment, we should aim to control external variables. If not, we cannot say that it is only. Let me try and see if I can mute everyone, because I'm getting some feedback from some of you. I'll try to see if I can, but it seems some people's mic is still on. I want to mute everybody. Sorry, please. I've not asked questions. Oh, your hand is up. Sorry, I just started. So I'm not going to. I've disabled everybody's mic. We just want some silence here so we can make progress. Thank you. All right. So if you are not able to control for the things that I've mentioned, what it means that extraneous variables. So extraneous variables are technically they are potential independent variables, but we'll explain this during the course of the lecture, maybe next week. All right. So in every true experiment, internal validity should be established. Now, what is internal validity? Usually, we want to find out how alcohol intake influences memory. If we are sure that the changes in memory or changes in recall is due to the administration of alcohol, and we can establish cause and effect relationship. Or we are doing an experiment on how self-esteem influences body image, okay, or body image, for example. And then we are sure that we control for all other things. There are so many things that can influence one's body age. Body image, sorry. Some factors like, for example, socioeconomic status, whether we are rich or poor, even place of residence, where you live, sometimes cultural backgrounds and all this. If you're able to control for all these other factors, and we see that it is only self-esteem that is causing or influences body image, then we say that the experiment has what we call internal validity. Internal validity. So in every experiment, our aim is to achieve internal validity. You can only achieve that when you establish a cause and effect relationship. In fact, if you look at all the research approaches, it is only experimentation. It is only an experiment that can give you cause and effect relationship. So any experiment that we want to do, the one who want to conduct the experiment will have control about who takes part in the experiment. How many people do I want? What do I want to do? When do I want to do it? Where will it take place? Will it take place in the laboratory or will it take place in the field? And how are you going to conduct it? Who will be selected? At what point in time? And all that. So these are key questions which every person who wants to do experiment will think about. So I've mentioned about random assignment and random selection. So random assignment means that if we have two groups, so we want to create two groups in an experiment to see whether alcohol intake. So one group, we give them maybe one thought of alcohol every week or every day. And the other group, we don't give them anything. But if we want to get a good result, people should not know which group they are going to belong. So if we do it in such a way that people don't know whether they belong to the experimental or the control group, then what we've done is called random assignment. And then we'll talk more about this as we go along in the semester. All right. So the first thing we want to talk about is the research settings. Where do we conduct experiment settings? In which particular settings do we conduct? So I've mentioned earlier that we can conduct experiments in the laboratory or in the field settings. So in the laboratory, we use both laboratory and the field setting. So laboratory is ideally is not the usual, when we mention laboratory, our mind goes back to the science lab, but in psychology, we can, any environment that we control. So I can take you to a room where there are only computers, and then you sit down and say, okay, we are going to see some words that will be appearing on your screen. All that you have to do is to memorize these words and record them as they come. So in that particular environment, it's a laboratory because it's It's an artificial place that have been created by the researcher. So we look at these two into details. So whether we want to use field experiment or we want to use laboratory experiment, each of them may have their weaknesses and their strength. Okay, so the first one, laboratory experiments. So I mentioned that it is artificial, it is related to the setting which the behavior naturally occurs. So laboratory is usually conducted, the researcher precisely manipulates one or more variables and controls the influence of nearly all other extraneous variables. Because if we want to find out how participants in a certain environment are able to request, if I don't take you to a particular secure room, very quiet place, sometimes people walk in the way they are walking, and some people will walk and drag their feet. Some people will walk and be shouting and laughing. They are disturbances that can affect your recall or your memory or your attention. So what we do is that we want to make sure that any other thing which has the potential to influence your behavior is taken care of. And that is what we may call a laboratory experiment. I'm sure you remember Stanley Milgram's experiment. Stanley Milgram's experiment. Please, anybody has an idea of Stanley Milgram's experiment? Please, someone has put on his mic. Please, your video is on. Please, does anybody has an idea of what Stanley Milgram experiment is? You can raise your hand. I'll call you. Anybody with an idea? Hello, class. Are you there?
Yes, sir.
Can someone try?
Yes, sir. Please, I want to try.
Is it Gloria?
Yes, please.
Yeah, Gloria, you go ahead and then, okay, go ahead.
He was conducting an experiment on obedience.
Okay.
Taking commands. He wanted to know even why during that Hitler's time, why the people obeyed him and they were able to do what they did. So it brought how do I call it? I think someone holding a cane and.
Okay, but do you remember what they were asked to do? Can someone tell us what the participants were they asked to do? Sylvia. Sylvia, your hand is up. Please, if your hand is up, just talk so we can move on. They were put in a certain. What were they asked to do, participants? Sylvia, are you talking? We can't hear you. Okay, Abigail.
They were asked to electric shock.
Okay, so yes, so they were asked, and ideally, because it's within a particular environment, they were asked, and sometimes, as humans, even like 80 or 90 votes or 100 votes can kill people. But some of them, because they were asked to go on, they still carried on. Of course, we saw some ethical issues with that particular experiment. But of course, at the end, they were told that they were not actually given actual shock. It was pre-recorded voices, Some of them were screaming, "I don't want to do it again, get me out of here." And the man was telling them to continue. But that is a controlled laboratory setting of an experiment. So in laboratory settings, the researcher has control and put all possible disturbances or noise under control. The second form of setting is what we call the field experiment. So we conduct experiment in the natural or real settings. So participants in their own natural environment. So we just, and I'm sure you know what we call maybe bystander apathy, or even if you look at Solomon Asch experiment in social psychology, where some participants were asked which line is equal to the particular line they showed them. And that is that's a field experiment. People were in a classroom and they said, okay, this is an experiment, or something we call bystander apathy. Maybe we want to see whether people will help in cases of emergency. And then we create an emergency situation to see whether people will react. Those are what we call field experiments. So in these cases, there is also usually it's difficult to control external variables. Sometimes background noises or some disturbances within the natural setting, you cannot control them. So these are the two major settings in which we do conduct experiments. Let me talk about the type of variables, and then I will allow for class to ask questions. Please, you don't want me to always try and unmute your mic. Oh, Charlie. Some of you are in the class, so just put off your mic, that's all. Anyway, let's continue. So let's look at the type of variable. Obviously, we know about what we call independent variable, dependent variable, and extraneous variable. So from side 2 to 1, these three guys, you shouldn't forget about them at all. Independent variable, dependent, but whether they are independent variable or dependent variable, or even sometimes extraneous variable, they come in different forms. They comes in different forms, and we know what is a variable means. Anything, any event, any behavior, or any characteristics that can vary, that can change its forms, or that can be varied, is called a variable. So, for example, height, gender in our own context, whether it's a male or female, and that is a variable because we have two categories. So we cannot do any experiment without having variables. So every experiment, at least, we should have the independent variable, the dependent variable, and extraneous variables should be controlled. All right. So there are some forms of variables, okay? Some forms of variables, whether they are independent, they are dependent, or they are controlled, they may also come in different forms. They may also come in different forms, and that's what I want to draw your attention to. So we could have some variable that could be discrete or continuous, and some variables that can be qualitative or quantitative in nature. All right, so which variables are discrete? So we usually talk about discrete when we talk about maybe variables that are measured solely in whole, or in units, or in categories, or we can say they are mutually exclusive. Let me put it in that way. Things that are mutually exclusive. So discrete variables, they don't have intermediaries. So like textbook, but or something. So if we have race, of course in Ghana we don't have race. What we may have will be ethnic backgrounds. Okay, so in the US and even in South Africa, they have race. So in South Africa, they have 4 different kinds of people. And discrete means that you cannot belong to here and there. So in South Africa, they have white South Africans, they have black South Africans, they have Indian South Africans, and they have colored South Africans. So the colored in Ghana will refer to them as half caste. Half caste, they call them colored. So race is a discrete variable, it's mutually exclusive. Of course, sex or gender is also mutually exclusive, unless you are not happy or people want to do different forms of sexual orientations. I'm talking about the LGBTQ plus and all that. So either you are sick or you are well. So discrete variables may come in discrete form. So you belong to only one of these categories. You cannot be an Indian and be a white person at the same time. So that is the definition of discrete. So some variables that we use in our experiment or in our research, they can be discrete variables, and we see gender here or sex here. The other forms of variable is what we call continuous. So if it is not discrete, then it can be continuous. So continuous means that it comes in a continuum and can be represented by whole numbers or fraction units. So there's no restrictions of values. Okay, so we can look at the employees' attitude towards work. Their attitude towards work can be classified to be positive, to be extremely positive or extremely negative, and all that. So variables that are continuous, there's no restriction to particular values. So something like age is a continuous variable that we also use in research. Now, some form of variables can also be qualitative in kind. Qualitative. So some variables can also be qualitative in kind. So qualitative means that they vary in kind. They vary in kind. We know the word talks about quality. So a quality or attribute of a situation that participants are exposed to. So we can vary the lighting system in the room, and it can be dim, it can be bright, it can be extra bright or something. So qualitative variables are variables that vary in kind. They vary in kind. But if it's also not qualitative, then it can also be quantitative. So quantitative means it varies in amount. So we have different levels of measurement in which we can measure, time. Time could be measured in hours, minutes, seconds, days, weeks, months, and all that. So these are the other variable. But remember, whether the variable is IV or DV or extraneous, it can take any of these forms of categories. All right, so I want to pause here. If you have question, you can raise your hand quickly, and then let me try and unmute everybody. And then okay, do you have a hand up? Okay, there's someone's hand up. Sarah Entry, please mute yourself. Hey. I've seen, is it Agbe no? Sorry if I'm not able to pronounce your name well. Your hand is up. Okay, Divine.
Hello, Doc.
Yes, Divine.
Hello. Yes, please. Please, can you kindly throw a little light on what variables are?
So variable is anything, any characteristics, anything that can change its form, or anything that can vary. So light is a variable, height is a variable. So height can be classified. We can get people who are tall or short. Age can be classified, old, young, children in that particular form. So anything that you can change its form. So stress can be a psychological variable. We can have high level of stress, low level of stress, and all that. So anything that any attribute characteristic that can change its form is called a variable. Are you okay?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much.
Okay. Is it Catherine? Tete?
Yes, sir. Yes, Doc.
Yes.
Please, I want to know how can a researcher controls variables in an experiment? I mean, experimental studies.
How can you control what? Control variables or control external variables?
Yes, please.
Your line was breaking. Okay, so we'll come to there are different ways. There are different ways we can control external variables depending on what type of experiment you are conducting. So what I mentioned about randomization is a technique that we use to control for external variables. If people don't know whether they will be selected or not, and which group they will be put into, is also a control mechanism. Okay, Nia Jemai. So, Catherine, thank you. Just mute yourself. Yes. And you can drop your hand. Thank you. Nia Jemai. Okay, Ishmael. Can I please advise that when you raise your hand, be by your set and answer question. Please don't raise your hand, and if we call you, you cannot talk. I don't think it's fair on us. Yes, Ishmael.
Thank you for the opportunity. I want you to explain more around the internal paradigm.
Ishmael, your voice is far away. I don't know if I'm the only person who can hardly hear you. Let the earpiece get closer to your mouth, please. Go ahead. Yes.
I'm not clear with the internal paradigm they talked about.
Are you saying the internal validity?
Yes.
Don't worry, I'll come back to internal validity. I'll come back to it. Presla, yes, thank you, Ishmael. Presla. Please, can I ask if you are not talking, just mute yourself, okay, please. Yes. Can a variable be what? Can you speak louder, Priscilla? Okay. But what I'm saying is that a variable cannot take any two of the forms. A variable can either be qualitative or quantitative. It can be discrete or continuous. It cannot take any of the two forms.
Okay.
Edward, last person, and then we'll continue. Edward.
Sir, at what stage in experiments an experimental control external variable?
Okay, so Edward, I think when you start designing the experiment, you should have in mind possible factors that can influence your result. So I talk about when, how, who, and all that. So the experimenter or the researcher should have all this in mind. And remember, because you've already read the literature, you may not be the first person doing something similar. You may know some of these characteristics. So you set in mechanisms to control these variables at the beginning of the experiment. If you wait for you to finish the experiment and then control, it's not going to work. Because some of these variables are inherent within the environment or within the individuals who are serving as participants for you.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Okay. All right. Please, everybody drop your hand. I'm not going to call anybody. I think I indicated that Edward was the last person. So please, let's move on. Thank you. All right. So we want to talk about, of course, these are old friends, IV, DV, and EV. So these are old friends. And now the independent variable, and for those of you who have struggled to get this, I'm not going to ask in IE or end of semester exams what is independent variable. No, we can put some research scenarios in, and then ask you in this case, what do you think the independent variable will be? So the variable that the researcher is intentionally changing. So in classical experiment, we call the IV as the experimental variable. You know, the variable that is manipulated. It is the influential manipulated variable. The variable that the researcher aims to change its form. So we want to look at alcohol. So how do we change alcohol? We can vary alcohol into, for example, 3 levels. We can have 1, no alcohol; 2, those who take 1 tot; and 3, those who take 1 glass. As the researcher, I have changed alcohol, the form of alcohol that should be administered. Either you don't take alcohol, either you take 1 tot, or you take 1 glass. What I've done as the experimenter is that I'm changing how I vary the variable in my study. So as much as possible, the variable that the researcher should be interested in, the variable that it is manipulated, the variable that is the researcher is intentionally changing, varying it, is called the independent variable. Independent because it's on its own. It's on its own, and it's based on whether it changes its form or not. We'll see its effect on the other one. So, increasing the number of tutorials attended will increase academic performance. Our emphasis here is on tutorial attendance. Emphasis is on tutorial attendance. So we can take those who don't attend tutorials and those who attend tutorials. Or we can, that is one level of varying, and we'll call it presence or absence, with and without. Another level, we can say those who attended tutorial once, those who attended tutorial 2 to 5 times, and those who attended tutorial 5 times or more. And that's also 3 levels of varying the tutorials. And this will lead to increase in academic performance. And of course, academic performance here will be our dependent variable. So just take note that the variable, and how do you identify a variable in an experiment when we weighed it? So some questions can be, in this experiment, the researcher want to examine how, or want to see the effect of. So the effect of the word that comes after is always your independent variable, or the influence of something. So of the effect of A on B. So usually the researcher want to look at how sleep quality influences academic performance. It is very important for each one of you to Don't rush. Just read the scenario before you move to answer it. So, how do we change the form of independent variable? Okay. So the first forms of variation. So I think someone asked the independent. So the variation, we have what we call presence and absence techniques. Okay. So we want to find out the effect of alcohol intake on maybe risk perception of drivers or commercial drivers in Accra, Ghana. We want to see how the effect of alcohol on risk perception. So I can have two categories of maybe drivers, or I can have two categories of the IV. So I can have two. So we have those who will be given alcohol and those who will not be given alcohol. So the simplest form where we can manipulate a change independent variables is called what we call the presence and absence. Those who are exposed to and those who are not exposed to. We want to find out how tutorial attendance influences academic performance. So we can create two groups, those who attend tutorials and those who do not attend tutorials. In this simplest form, these are the two levels in which we can vary the independent variable. So the presence and absence. Okay, so we have an exercise feedback. We cannot, maybe you want to find out how exercise influences weight loss, or does exercise have an effect on one's metabolism, for example. So we can have those who do exercise and those who do not do exercise, and then we compare them on their levels of metabolism. Or we want to find out how lecturers' feedback influences student performance. So some students, you don't give them feedback at all, but others you give them feedback when they bring their assignment, and they want to know whether this will influence their performance. So that is the first level in which we can vary the independent variable. Remember, it is presence and absence. The second one is what we call administering different amounts of the independent variable to each of the groups. So here we can go back to alcohol. So remember, when I talk about commercial drivers and their risk perception, I talk about those who will take alcohol and those who will not take alcohol. But sometimes we can create more than two levels of the amount of the IVs. So we can have a group who will not take any bottle of beer at all. So zero. One group, they take 0 bottles of beer in a week. The next group, they take 2 bottles of beers in a week. The third group, they take 2 bottles of beers. 5 bottles of beer in a week. So I have 3. So here I'm changing the amount of the IV that I give. So one group, no beer at all. The second group, 1 bottles. The third group, 2 bottles. And the fourth group, 5 bottles. Then at the end of the week, and this is per week, at the end of the week, we want to assess their risk perception. All right. Now, and please note the difference. In the first instance, we call it presence or absence. First one, something they will have and others do not have. The second one, we change the amount of the independent variable. So if we're talking about tutorials, then we can have maybe, as I said, those who go for tutorial once in a semester, 2 to 5 times or 5 times and more. And that is the quantity, the variation. Now, the third one, So this is where the difference comes from. The third one is when we are administering the different types. So in the first instance, we have presence and absence. In the second instance, we change the variations of the amount of the IV. In the third instance, we look at the different types of the IV. So we talk about feedback. In the presence and absence, we say we can give some student feedback, and then some student will not give them feedback. That is presence and absence. But in the third part, which is different types of the independent variable, here we have different types. So we can give some positive feedback and we can give some negative feedback. All right. So and this is where, or some will attend maybe tutorials that have good TAs, and some will go to tutorials that have TAs that are not too good. Because this is a little technical, I want to, if you have any question, okay, let me finish. So this is what I've mentioned. All the three things that I've mentioned are ways in which we can vary the independent variables. There are ways in which we can change the form of the independent variable. Remember, the independent variable is a variable that we can manipulate, change its form to see that it has an effect on some other variable, which we call the dependent variable. So what I've shown you are the various levels of variation. How do we change its forms, the various forms that it comes with? So ideally, when we manipulate one variable, we should see the change in something else. We want to see how alcohol intake influences risk perception, the effect of A on B. The B that we are interested is called the dependent variable. So the dependent variable is the variable that we observe and record, or we call it the measurable variable. It's the variable that we measure. We want to see how tutorial attendance influences academic performance. We measure academic performance by IA scores, end of semester grade, GPA, or your class, or final GPA and all that. The variable that is observed, the variable that we measure, that is the dependent variable. It is dependent because it is not on its own. When the British were in Ghana, we were not an independent state. So if you are with your parents and they are paying your school fees, you are depending on them. Depending on their financial situation, your situation may also change. I told the class my stepdad was a policeman, and then wherever we go, so because we are depending on him, anywhere he's transferred, we move. So you move, you move from 37, you go to Sugakope, and then you go to Commander and all that. What we are doing is that we are following him, so we are dependent on his movement. And he, as a father, is the independent. Where he moves will determine our status. So if you are dependent on someone, when the person becomes broke, automatically you are hot. So the dependent variables are the variables that we expect to change as a result of some manipulation. Whether you attend tutorials or not, the difference will find it out on the outcome of your end of semester results. So just take note, the variable that we are interested in observing, the variable that we are interested in recording is called the dependent variable. And finally, on these levels is the variable that we want to control. I mentioned earlier that extraneous variables, and just take note, Extraneous variables are potential independent variables. What it means is that if you remove the independent variable, now we want to, so for example, this was sometimes I like writing on the board. So for example, we want to look at the effect of tutorial attendance on end of semester exams. Okay, so we have tutorial attendance end of semester. So our IV is tutorials attendance, and our DV is end of semester exams. So you tell me, if you remove tutorial attendance, what other thing do you think can influence your grade at the end of the semester? One, your learning strategies or learning pedagogies. Two, the quality of teaching in the classroom. IQ is one. Even sometimes, if you worry about money, socioeconomic status, if you don't have money, your brain is not stable. You keep on thinking about where your next meal will come from. Now, all these things that I've mentioned, if you remove tutorials from the picture, so the effect of tutorials on end of semester score, if I remove, I will put the effect of IQ on end of semester exams. So if you don't control for all these four things that I've mentioned, your result will not be accurate. You cannot have internal validity. So as much as possible, if you don't control for extraneous variables, in some textbooks, they also call it confounding variables. So extraneous variables can also be called confounding variables. All right. So before I move to my third and final part of the lecture, maybe I'll open up the floor for some questions and then we move on. Okay, Ishmael, is your hand still up or is the old one?
No, sir.
Okay, let's is Ishmael, are you there?
Hello,
If Ishmael is not there, please, I'm calling according to the hands raised. Don't unmute yourself until you are called, please. Gentlemen, please, let's mute ourselves, please. John Yeboah, whatever you ask, okay, please mute yourself and respect your colleagues. If you are not ready to talk, don't put off your mic. Don't annoy us this afternoon, please. If I have not called you, don't put on your mic. Yes, Daniel. I'm calling according to what I see on my screen here. So if I have not called you, please mute yourself. Yes, Daniel.
Okay, Doc. Please, I just want to find out if there is any variation in the dependent variables.
Daniel, in which form? Can you come clearer? Which variation are you looking for?
Okay, as in the presence versus the absence technique.
Okay, so in the presence versus absence technique, it's simple. So one group we give alcohol, one group we don't. That's all. Presence and absence. Tutorials, no tutorials. Feedback, no feedback. Yes. Muniru. Oh, Muniru, your hand.
Yes,
okay, Niajiman.
Yeah, good.
Niajiman.
Good afternoon.
Yes.
Good afternoon, Doc.
Who is talking?
This is Muniru.
Niajiman. Muniru, you drop your hand and you are talking. So I was calling you, so I thought you drop your hand.
No, I did not.
Okay, you go ahead,
All right.
Muniru.
Okay, please, Doc. My question: how can
Muniru, take your time, okay? Take your time.
Okay.
Take your time.
All right.
Take your time.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Please, my question is how to identify extraneous variable in an experiment.
Okay.
How can we? Yes.
So usually, that's why I'm said for you, it is not as the experimenter or the researcher is the one. Now remember, before you conduct any experiment, in the first lecture we talk about the scientific methodology. You need to read around the area. So as you read around, you know what others have done and how some variables were considered as potential or extraneous variables. If you know them, then you put in mechanisms to control. So we talk about ways in which we can control for extraneous variables in the subsequent weeks as part of this course. So we deal with that.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, Mario, you can mute yourself. Yes, Niajima.
Yeah, Doc, please, good evening.
Yes, good evening.
Doc, please, with all due respect, can you please pinpoint what the extraneous variable is in Solomon Ash's conformity experiment so that I can relate it to what we are learning, sir?
Okay, so if you look at Solomon Ash experiment, and I'll come to it, thank you for asking this. So sometimes in Solomon Ash experiment, and I'll tell you there's something we call confederate. I was going to talk about it. Now, if we have something called confederates. There are some people around, and sometimes just in a real world. Let's, for example, sometimes you see people gathered somewhere, and they say, "Oh, if you throw this thing, you win this." And you see one people threw it, they won. The president they won. You'll be surprised that all those people that are winning, they are part of the clique. They are doing to sway your response, and then you also go and bet. Only when you throw it, you will not win. So what is happening? Please, can we try and mute ourselves? So what happens is that in Solomon Ash experiment, they were confederate, and I'll come to it. So you could see, if you type Solomon Ash experiment about the lines, there were people who knew the purpose of the experiment, but they were giving the wrong responses to see how you react. And you can see some of them started choosing the right one, but a lot of the class were choosing the wrong one. They started changing their behaviors. So we sometimes may not have such incidents in some experiment, and those ones you could see that they held it in a controlled a little bit of the environment. But those are some of the ways. It depends on also the purpose of the experiment. For example, if we want to look at class one, if you want to look at the effect of, for example, the effect of, don't worry. If you want to look at bystander apathy, the likelihood for people to help in an emergency situation. Sometimes you see that this is an emergency situation, but you realize that all the people around knew that they are part of the research. So they wouldn't do anything, wanted to look at your reaction. So those people may be classified as confederate. And let me pick two other questions, and then we'll look at the last part of this lecture. I have about 6 more slides, and we are out of here. Yes, Joyce. So Niajima, I hope you are fine. Okay, Joyce. Your voice is far away. Get closer to your mic.
Hi, can you hear me?
This is better, yes.
Okay. Can one say that experimental variable is the same as independent variable?
I think I mentioned that. I mentioned that the experimental variable or the manipulated variable or the influential variable is the independent variable. Benjamin, last person, and then we'll continue.
Good evening, sir.
Hi, Benjamin. Good evening.
Yes, please. Can we take dependent variables in other words is the result obtained from the experiment?
Is a result.
Yes, obtained from the experiment.
Benjamin, I would rather look at the outcome variable, okay? If you talk about the result may include so many other things. So it's the outcome that we are looking at. Okay, so that is the outcome variable. So the outcome variable is always measured. That's why we say the DV is also the measured variable, the variable that we can measure, the measurable variable. Ben, are you okay?
Yes, thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you for the questions. So if you can all drop, let me mute everybody. Any possible disturbance? I'm lowering all hands here. All right. So the last part of today's class, I want to introduce you to some terminologies that we use in experimentations. Some terminologies that we use in experimentation. So I want to take them one after the other, and I'm sure some you may have heard from intro or some other class. Because when I do intro, I usually mention some of this. But so the first thing is population. So population is an entire collection of group of people, okay, that the researcher want to select participants from. Now, if I'm interested in DE student, distance education student, so all categories of students who are part of the DE program, you will be my population. So we are interested in University of Ghana students. All students who are enrolled in University of Ghana programs will be part of my population. But if I'm interested in DE psychology student, then I'm looking at from level 100 to 400. All these students who are doing psychology, they will be my population. So they are made up of all individuals of interest to the researcher. If I want to find out main campus students attend, how their attendance to tutorials influences their end of semester, then I'm looking at main campus psychology student. So please remember, if you want to do any research, the people who are interest to you, they become the whole category of people, they become your population. They become your population. All right. Now, the population within the population is the sample. You cannot use all psychology distance education student or distance education student, for example. I just need 200 students. So the 200 students that I will select from the 6,000 or 7,000 DE students, they will be my sample. So the sample is a subset. So when you draw a big circle and you draw another small circle in that big one, that small circle becomes your sample and the big one is your population. So we draw samples from populations. So when we meet next year in research methods, we'll talk about ways in which we can sample people from population. So how what we call probability sampling and non-probability sampling. In effect, probability means that everybody has a chance of being selected, and that is probability. The non-probability means that the chance of being selected is not there. So probability sampling, for example, simple random. When I come to this class and I said I need only 50 students for a project. Everybody will say, oh, say I'm interested. And I say, okay, I can't take all 250 on call now. But then what do I do? Okay, I want to go for balloting. I just need 50. And then I put pieces of papers and I say you should select. All those who select yes, I say thank you. All of you come here. The remaining 200 who selected no, we can't continue with you. We need only 50. Thank you. That is probability. That's simple random. But non-probability, sometimes we use them, at a convenience. So something like convenience sampling. I'm interested in 100 students of University of Ghana. I just walk around campus. Any student that I meet, are you a Legon student? Yes. Can you understand my question? I do that until I get the 200. That's convenient. So when you get to research methods, we'll explore more of this. And the type of sample and the method in which you use to select may have ramifications, may have implications for generalization. So we know that if you select more people, you can generalize the findings to the population. Okay. So if we talk about sample size, so the sample is a group of people, the subset of the population, and the number of people that I want, that becomes the sample size. Okay, that becomes the sample size. So usually when we are doing quantitative studies, like a lot of my studies that are published are quantitative. So quantitative studies, some of my longest students who are 5 students, each of them can collect as many as 300 questionnaires. So that those 5 students can collect about 1,500. And that is a quantitative descriptive research that we are doing. So quantitative research have large numbers, very large numbers. Some will do longitudinal study, examining maybe 1,000 people over 10 years. And then we also have what we call experiments. So experiments, we don't use too many people. So sometimes 100 or 90 of 3 groups each. And then we also have qualitative research. So qualitative research, we use lesser participants. So a study that I published with one of my undergraduate students 10 years ago, we wanted to look at why do people divorce? What are the factors that influences divorce? So Gina, I asked her, can you get people? She wanted to look at the effect, for example, the effect of divorce on children. And as a psychologist, the fact that people are coming from divorced family doesn't mean some other behaviors that they pick up maybe as a result of the divorce. There's several other confounding variables. There are so many other things that may have influenced the child, which may not be as a result of the disorganized family that they were in. So I asked her if we can get people who are divorced. She said yes. And I said, okay, let's interview them. So we got 12 people, and we did very nice research on factors that influences divorce among divorcees in Ghana. Quite an interesting work. So depending on the type of research that you do, also depends on your sample size. And now within the sample, individual people will call participants. So the 50 people that I will select from this DE class, it's like 224 class, you become my participants. So people who collaborate in an experiment for the purpose of allowing their behaviors to be studied. So as much as possible, we select people, participants, whether of course, most research has to be voluntary. So the people that we select, and we use very few people in experiment. And sometimes the type of study that we do will also determine the number of participants. As I said, quantitative study, we can have thousands of participants. I read a Chinese study that samples almost 1 million people during COVID-19 on the study, 1 million people. So, yes. And then, okay, so we have what we call experimental group. And please, I need your attention here because there are some questions, if I throw myself back into my question bank. So You remember we look at the first level of variation of the independent. If we are not, so in experiments, and just take note, in two groups. Every basic experiment we have two groups. We have experimental group and control group. I want to repeat. Every basic experiment that we conduct have two groups. Experimental group and control group. Now, you remember in the basic form of independent variable, presence and absence. So we have the group that we give the alcohol to and the group that we do not give them alcohol. And then at the end, we compare their recall or their memory. We assess their memory or comprehension. The group that always receive the independent variable, or what we call the experimental condition, is called the experimental group. So the experimental group, they receive the treatment condition. So the treatment condition is your IV. The experimental group, we want to look at how tutorial attendance influences academic performance. Those who will receive the tutorials are classified as experimental group. And that is the independent variable. And the group that will not receive, that will not go to any tutorials will be called the control group. So in experimentation, take note, the experimental group is also known as the treatment group. Now, let me explain here. In basic experiment, it's very simple. We have two groups. The group that we give the IV condition to is called the experimental group. So they will be attending tutorials, those who attend tutorials. Now, those who don't attend tutorials will be called the control group. At the end of the semester, we'll compare these two groups on their end of semester scores to see whether attendance or tutorials attendance has an effect of end of semester scores. So in every experimentation, we have experimental group and the control group. So the control group serves as the comparison group. The control group is also called the comparison group. So the control group are participants that do not receive any of the treatment or independent variable. So in our first example of variation of independent variable, the first group, which we say absence, the absence people of the condition, they are called the control group. In the presence of the IV is called the experimental group. So please take note, in every simple experiment that we conduct, at its basic level, there are two groups, experimental group and control group. At the end, we'll compare them. So those who take in alcohol and those who didn't take in alcohol. What will be the rate of accidents at the end of the month? We'll compare. And we assume that those who don't take alcohol will have lesser rate of accident than those who take. All right. Now, I think Niajima asked our confederates, and we'll talk about Solomon as experiment. So, finally, confederates in an experiment are people who have been instructed to behave in such a way that they can affect the response of the participant. So in the room of 6 people, you realize that all the 5 people, they know the purpose of the experiment, but they want to behave in such a way to see how you are going to react. And that was a classical case in Solomon's experiment of identification of the correct line. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, the last thing I'll talk about is called randomization. Randomization, I think I've mentioned. Now take note, randomization involves two things. Randomization means that we randomly select people. So I'll use balloting to say, in this class, I need 50 people. So the remaining 200, you cannot be packed. Thank you very much. That is the end of the road for you. So the remaining 50, I also need to group them into two, experimental and control group. But you do not know which group you'll be going. So in a group of 25 each, I'll just print yes and no, 25, 25. When you pick yes, I said those in the left, go here, those in the right, go here. And then we administer. So it's very important. Randomization is one of the techniques we use to control extraneous variables in experiments. I talk about internal validity, and so internal validity, if we know, and I mentioned that we are sure that self-esteem is the only thing that influences body image, and we are sure that we've controlled all possible extraneous variables, then we can see that our experiment have achieved internal validity. If we are sure that the cause and effect relationship between your IV and your DV is perfect, having control for all other variables, then you've achieved internal validity. If you do not, I said the last time that you can confound. Confounding variable means that extraneous variables can affect the outcome of your study if you do not control for them. And external validity. External validity means that if we can use the findings of the study and generalize it to the other people or situations in the population. So if we find something about University of Ghana students, and we study 1,500 University of Ghana students, then we want to generalize that, okay, University of Ghana students are intelligent, or they are punctual, or so and so. And that is the findings. We generalize. But remember, before you can generalize and have external validity, you need a large sample size. The bigger your sample size, so someone will say, if elections are held today or tomorrow, and I'm sure during the week we had one professor from KNUST who studied over 60,000 people from 275 constituencies. Talk about the presidential candidate that are popular and all that. But even with that, it's still a small sample size for us to take it as a serious study. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think I'm done. It's 4 minutes past 5 o'clock. I'm going to open the floor up for questions, comments, and then we are out of here. Thank you. Please be sure that you are ready to talk. If I call you and you are not ready, I'll jump you. Okay, Winfred. Please, if I have not called you, don't unmute yourself. Please mute yourself. If I have not called you, just continue muting yourself. Winfred.
Yeah, good evening once again, sir.
Yes, sir, I received it.
Please, I want to know that when you are conducting a research, must you also consider the geographical location? That is the researcher, but the researcher always consider the geographical location as well.
Yes, Winfred, that is correct. So it's all depend on the researcher. Sometimes, we've done some studies, for example, on gambling, and we realize that there's a lot of data coming from rural Ghana. So for this study, we'll go to rural Ghana, go to some villages or peri-urban settings where there are gambling slots, brought in by Chinese, and then we go there. So whether the geographical, and this what we talk about, when, how, who, and all these the things that will be determined by the researcher.
All right, sir.
Winfred, I hope. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yes, sir. I'm
Divine,
well.
are you okay, Winfred?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Sir.
All right, Divine.
You're welcome.
Hello, sir, Doc.
Yes.
You mentioned that the control group is also called
the comparison group. The comparison group.
Okay.
Yes.
I just want to clear that.
The comparison group. Yes.
All right.
Yes, Catherine.
Yeah. Yes, please. I want to ask, as a researcher, I'm controlling a extraneous variable in an experiment. How do I do it in order not to violate the right of those who are participating in the experiment?
Okay, so as I said, one of the ways of doing it is just using randomization, where people do not know. We assume that automatically the first level of balloting you did, if there is an IQ, we don't assume that all those that are intelligent will go out of the study, or those that are not knowledgeable will retain. No. The randomization allows us, obviously, and I said I will talk about ways in which we control external variables later in the lecture. So there are, besides randomization, there are other ways, like matching and all that, which we use to control. And of course, the fact is that you do not coerce people to be part of the experiment. You can't do that. If you are not ready, you don't select them. It is only people who have given consent that want to be part of the study that you include in your study.
Okay.
All right, Joshua. Joshua. All right.
Hello, Prof. Good evening, sir.
Yes. Good evening.
Sir, please, I want to ask, look, the name qualitative and quantitative, does it literally means that, as we know it literally, that if it's qualitative, then it's of high quality and quantitative is of low quality, or it's just the name? I don't know if you
know. Okay, Joshua, I got you. So, Joshua, listen. When we say, so, independent variable, dependent variable, and external variable can take any category of the form of variable, okay? They can be qualitative or quantitative. But qualitative means that hey, what's happening? they can just be variables that may just vary in kind, and that is the qualitative. So if we talk about lighting, the light can be dim or can be bright or can be dark. Okay, but if we talk about quantitative, we're talking about units. Variation in amount, like age. Age can be measured in days, months, weeks, and all that. Okay. There is
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much.
There is
They didn't care me long. Oh.
Hey. Oh, people. When we give instruction, if I start targeting you, you suffer. It's just indiscipline.
Prof, thank you very much. God bless you.
It's just indiscipline. It's unacceptable. Okay. We will wait. One day I'll come and teach and I'll close. I'll not allow for questions. If now you continue behaving. Yes. Prince. Prince, have you finished talking?
No, sir. You've not called me yet.
Okay, I'm calling you now.
Okay, sir. Thank you. Please, I would want you to throw a little light on the experiment group and the control group with respect to the independent variable.
Okay. So, George, it's called experimental group. Experimental group, yes. Okay. Experimental group, or it's also called the treatment group.
Okay.
So the experimental group and the control group. So I mentioned that in the basic level of variation, the presence and absence. When we say present, it means that group which will give the experimental conditions. So if we're talking about tutorials, we will look at those who attend tutorials. Those people will be called the experimental group because they contain the variable that we are interested in.
Okay.
And they are called experimental. The other one is called the control group. Control group do not contain, they are the students who don't attend tutorials.
Okay.
Then at the end of the experiment, we want to compare them look at their end of semester scores.
Okay.
And I mentioned that the control group is also called the comparison group.
Sure.
Okay. So, Winfred, you've asked question already. I'm not going to call you because our time is up. But you keep your hand up. Sakina. I don't know if I got it right. Is it Sakina? Those of you who raise your hand and you don't want to talk, next time I will not call you. George, please, can you drop your hand? Niajima.
Hello, Prof.
Yes, Niajima.
I'm very grateful. I think one of the reasons why I joined this very class is to understand what the strenuous variables are, and then I'm so glad you have met my expectation. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Niajima. Yeah, Winfred and Rebecca, and then we are out of here. Winfred, if you are not talking, I'll call. Yes, quickly.
Here, sir. Please,
okay, I can hear you, sir. I can hear you.
Mine is just to draw your attention back again to the noise in the class. No, sir, please, this thing has been with us for some time now. And it's a tank I really affects most of us. So all I'm trying to suggest is that I think if the people are not ready, or it's like they try to make noise, it's take them out of the group. Maybe they can join again, and if they continue again, I think you just take them out of the class if they cannot join again, because they are doing sometimes affect most of us who are in our.
Winfred, I think you have a legitimate point. Well noted. Okay. Well noted.
All right.
I'll be taking those who will be disturbing the class. I will take your names, and then we'll punish you at the end of the semester. You lose marks. Rebecca. After Rebecca, I'll call Felix, and then I'll end. I'm not going to call anybody. Rebecca, please speak.
Good evening, Prof.
Yes, good evening.
Please, my question is about the qualitative research, the variable. So, if a research is being done,
so is it quality? Let me get. Are you talking about qualitative research or qualitative variable?
The quantitative. Sorry.
Okay.
Okay. So, if a research is being done, and let's say the number is not up to 100 and is between maybe 90 to 100, can you classify it as a quantitative method?
It says quantitative. No, it's still quantitative. It is.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah. Felix, take coffee, and then we are out of here. Somewhere, Sichofe, please put off your video. We don't want to see your fan, please. We don't want to see your ceiling fan. Hey, what is happening here?
I said to Afia, what's wrong with you?
Yeah, hello, sir.
Yes. Yes, Felix.
Thank you for the opportunity. Sir, please spare our timetable. Tomorrow we are supposed to go to face, and you have met us today. Can we go to the face tomorrow? The timetable.
Is the face not for the tutors, or I'm not too sure. But me, I'm not going anywhere tomorrow.
Okay.
I'm not going anywhere tomorrow. I'm sorry.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yes. All right. Okay. So thank you very much. Today's class, we almost had 280 students. There's some few people drop. So next week we'll continue. I'll send you the link